Well, hello, thank you for joining me. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how does a steam-assisted gravity drainage procedure starts? Like what is a start? How do you create communication between injector and producer? So for example, you have an injecting well, a producing well, and where my fingers are, if this formation initially is a hockey puck, how does the fluid know to flow from that section, the upper section, all the way downwards? Meaning, how do you create a channel of communication, a chamber in a sense, or a cavern that could drain that oil by gravity through the production well and produce it to surface? I mean, the same thing is applicable to infill wells as well, because you need to be able to produce stuff from infill wells, which is kind of adjacent in later stages where the oil is mobile. But today, let's talk about the circulation phase, which is extremely important. And there are many innovations that focus on late life strategies like non-condensable gas, maybe solvent co-injection. Some solvent co-injection could happen initially, but how do you do the startup circulation, right? How do you get things moving? And we're going to talk about why is it important. So basically, SAGD is a thermal recovery technique, right? It's used to extract highly viscous heavy oil and bitumen, which you can have viscosity here. Initial viscosity is at maybe 11 degrees, as high as million centipoise. It could be as high as 10 million centipoise. And what typically happens is that to produce the oil very deep on the ground, which could be like 400 meters, 350 meters, 420 meters or so, you will drill an injection well and a production well. But now the challenge is, okay, well, we have those two wells, they're horizontal wells, but how do we start the process? So you need to start circulating. And before oil production begins, the reservoir between these wells needs to be heated to establish thermal, right? Thermal and hydraulic communication, meaning there needs to be flow. And this is where basically the startup circulation phase comes in. Without a proper startup, the bitumen remains too viscous, and it's really important to circulate the swell across the entire section of the swells. Like now, those swells could be as long as maybe a kilometer, maybe something like 800 meters. And there's lots of heterogeneity, lots of different geology that could vary across those sections. And so how do you properly circulate the wells, create that communication so oil can be drained by gravity towards the producer? So, and the goal is really to uniformly heat the reservoir really to temperature where oil becomes mobile. And this could happen, I would say, between maybe like above 80 degrees Celsius, but maybe over above 150 is maybe not as necessary. But as long as you're able to kind of heat up that section, you will achieve that goal. So let's talk about how does a startup circulation work. So the circulation phase, it typically would last for like 3 to 6 months, and I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe up to 3 months. Maybe up to 3 months. 6 months is a little bit extensive. Maybe in the past it used to be a little bit more like 6 months, but maybe the startup stage could start kind of from the maybe 0 to 6 months, but circulation maybe up to 3 months, and it was circulating the steam in both injection and production wells to preheat the reservoir. So basically, injection of steam happens in the injector and in the producer, and you're trying to kind of establish communication by that heat transfer, where both wells provide that heat, and now you're able to kind of have that section that's fully basically able to drain fluids that's going to be coming from the remaining chamber. And steam is injected into both wells and through the tubing inserted inside the well liners. So there will be a liner and there will be an additional tubing where you circulate those wells. The steam will travel down the tubing and it will hit the surrounding formation basically, and it returns to surface through or via the basically annulus, so the casing, right? Uh, and the annulus is kind of that space between the tubing and the casing, essentially. So there's space between, and it will kind of come out that way. But the idea here is not really recover necessarily oil, but to create that initial communication. This heated zone that's being created, it basically expands over the course of time as the heat is being transferred. Now, those reservoirs are typically very good in keeping the heat in situ, so they will not like there will be very minimal heat losses between those wells. That's why it's a very efficient procedure. Obviously, bitumen viscosity will be reduced significantly, and it will make it for oil much easier later on to be drained by gravity. So once we establish the communication, again, the key objective is continually to heat the pathways through the injector producer wells and ensure that when steam injection begins to the injector, that it can form that steam chamber effectively and reach kind of the oil that's drained can reach the producer. Now, typically the reservoir is heated until the bitumen viscosity drops significantly, so it can allow that fluid communication. And like I said, it could happen at like 80 degrees, 100 degrees or so, maybe a little bit higher. During the procedure, when it happens, the engineers, the operators, they will monitor basically temperature, pressure, the fluid return, the condensed steam, the mobilized bitumen, right, and confirm that communication. So there will be tools, for example, like thermocouples that measure temperature that could be distributed along the wells, and they basically sense the temperature and report back to surface what's seen. And obviously at certain conditions, the oil is it's so hot that it can flow. So imagine like honey, when you heat honey in the microwave, there will be a point where that honey is not as viscous and it becomes more like water, right? So it can flow much easier. And so that will happen at a certain temperature for that honey. And the same thing with just like molasses for bitumen. And once communication is established after often, close to 3 months or so, maybe now the industry is getting really really good, so maybe under 3 months, but the initial stage is still kind of continuing up to, I would say, like 4, 5, 6 months, where now you basically growing the operating the SAGD operation, and now you're growing the chamber, but you're still kind of working on establishing that communication that you kind of established initially. So the circulation phase ends officially once you take out the tubing that we're circulating and kind of starts like the operation where you inject steam through the injection well. So you inject steam through an upper well, injection well, and you produce oil and condensed steam through the production well. So the bottom well here. Some of the challenges through circulation, like I said, you can have a uniform heterogeneity, so variation in rock properties, different permeabilities. You can have like clays. This could yield basically uneven heating and delaying that initial communication. So, for example, in some sections you can have very good communication, but in other section maybe not as good. Obviously, energy efficiency. I mean that you're not producing oil necessarily when you do that, and so you input significant energy to reduce the viscosity of the oil so it can be drained by gravity. And so maybe one could argue it's not maybe as efficient from energy perspective. And well integrity, the companies are pretty good maintaining well integrity during circulation stages, but obviously there's always risk because you have high temperatures, high pressures. There's kind of some stresses on the different components of the well, and you really need like good carbon steel, good completions to with careful monitoring to operate that properly. And obviously it's a very regulated sector, so companies do a good job in that aspect. And obviously, it costs money to operate that operation, but then through the netback, as you produce oil, as you netback back, you're able to retrieve that investment back. And let's kind of conclude based on why circulation matters. Well, you need to ensure uniform heating, maximize the chamber growth for kind of later stages, really good communication between injector producers so things can drain by gravity. You can reduce risk associated with operational issues in the future. For example, if in one section you inject steam and the other section is not properly circulated, there's no communication, you can't really drain that oil by gravity, and it will be very inefficient because now where do you inject the steam to, right? So that creates some risks. You set up basically, if you circulate well, you set up the oil recovery scheme for success. You can integrate things like non-condensable gases later on that could kind of optimize the operation in later stages. And in my view, personally, circulation is a very important stage because it really sets up kind of the economic environment for what's coming and the drainage that's going to happen. So in summary, Circulation phase is a very important phase in SAGD, and by circulating steam to establish thermal communication between the wells, it really lays kind of the initial groundwork for steam chamber development that's going to come next, maybe after like 3 months or so. And you do have challenges like energy intensity, reservoir heterogeneity, variability. But if you're able to successfully kind of circulate the wells and establish that communication, you position yourself for success operating the SAGD wells, which obviously, as we know, can last for a decade, maybe even 2 decades, and produce oil at very steady rates. Thank you so much.